Hi, folks. You're very welcome to the first in our DSS summer webinar series. And our guest tonight is Greg Hollins from the IRFU, even though he's somebody who's jetted in from somewhere else to work with the IRFU. And he'll tell you all about himself and his work. And the title of tonight's webinar is Managing and Maximising Data in Performance Sports. And if Greg has agreed that if you have any questions, just to put them in the chat, and at some stage he may see them in the chat, or else may wait until the very end, but he's very open to questions. And this webinar should be available later in the week. So just a big warm welcome to Greg, and I hope you enjoy it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. You've made that sound like I'm coming in from somewhere exotic. It's just across the water in Scotland. It's nothing too wild, but no, I moved to Ireland in January 2020, just in time for the whole world to close down. So yeah, it was a interesting time, but no, I'm really enjoying it. Settled here in Ireland. So yeah, working with the RFU in one of their new pathway roles on the women's side, and then was contracted as the kind of sports scientist, athletic performance coach hybrid role for the Women's Six Nations. So an interesting role. I'm really enjoying it so far. So it's wide ranging, and as with any role, it evolves and adapts over time. And as I'll go into a little bit, is I'm a strength and conditioning coach by background, and I've kind of evolved some data skills along the way, and then that just kind of snowballs into a few things. So yeah, as Mark said, anyone feel free to ask the questions, and I'll get to them either at the end or as we go. I'll start sharing what I've got for us.
Brilliant. That's come up, Greg.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I can't move that bar. Yeah, we go. Can everyone see that? Can you see that, Mark?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Perfect. So the first thing would just be a bit around perspectives. There's lots of real cliche things I could have gone with here, but mainly around just understanding what perspectives that we all have. And as I said, I'm a strength and conditioning coach. I'm not a data scientist, and I'm sure there's a few things that I'll probably do that a data scientist, and we've got one here at the RFU. We're very lucky in that aspect, but it probably drives them a bit mad. So yeah, just having the perspective that I'm a strength and conditioning coach who's figuring out his data along the way. And what does that look like? Obviously, anytime we're communicating data, there's going to be multiple people involved, but you're definitely going to have 99% of the time. Is you're going to have yourself, you're going to have the athlete, and you're going to have a coach of some description. And it's just, how do we communicate within those three? And then obviously, as things expand and grow, everyone has a different environment, right? So we're very lucky here. The physical performance team on the national women's side is 7. So there's quite a few of us within our department. And then obviously you have the coaching, the analysis, all the other support services that go along with it. So very quickly that can snowball. And then obviously within my role with the women's 15s program, we obviously have dual players who go back and forwards between 7s and 15s. And then we've got communications to the provinces, age grade pathways at 18s and 20s. So that organization can grow quite quickly. So it's just being aware of any time we're handling data and that we're managing these things, that we have to be able to communicate that really widely, and just being aware of that, and that's kind of my perspective so far. So again, I see it a bit like a stream of kind of what different streams of data do we have coming in, where are they coming from, and where are they all flowing to? There's a conversation obviously to be had around data driven versus data informed. And for me, I think we use data driven as kind of a catchy buzzword. And I think that both definitely have their pros and cons. You know, sometimes for me, data driven is it's the data, we make decisions based off it instantly. Data informed is we take that data, we look at it, we are the humans that make the decisions. And for me, I think that's my preference most of the time, but I think there's definitely times where being data driven, just looking purely at the numbers, and this is something speaking to the data scientist here, is sometimes that we actually have our biases, and that actually our biases cloud our opinions rather than actually looking at what the data tells us. So there is definitely time for just looking at what the data tells us, but then also data does lie to us, right? It's there's all those graphics of the data sets that all have the same means and standard deviations, but they show drastically different pictures. So I think it's just worth having that conversation early of, are we data driven or are we data informed? And there being a time for both of those things. And data can be a bit of a rabbit hole. You know, there's so many different sources of data, so many different metrics available on all these different tools. There's so many different rabbit holes that we can go down, and so many things that we can overcomplicate. And sometimes actually it's just remembering where we do want to get to and what actually helps us. So what helps us move the needle, and is that juice worth the squeeze? So no matter how many people you have on staff in some of the organizations around the world, or you have staffs of 20 plus, there's always a time constraint. There's always demands on us. So is it actually going to help us move the needle? So in my current role, is it going to help us develop young female rugby players? And is it going to help us win games? And then it might do that, but is that juice worth the squeeze? And what time is that taking away from any other things that I could be doing that are also going to help us on that same path? So in terms of coming back to key questions, and I think this is something that we often we skip by and we just go with, oh, the fancy shiny tools, rather than actually, what are the key questions I want to answer, and using the data to do that rather than the other way around. So in women's rugby, what are the demands of the game? Are our players prepared for those demands? How are they responding to the demands that we're placing on them? And then within those three questions, you've got short-term, fast, impactful stuff, and we've got longer-term planning and longer-term picture building, both of which are equally important across those questions. So in terms of my process around data, it's collect it, clean it, visualize it, interpret it, and then communicate it. And obviously you present a graphic like that, it looks perfectly linear and it's real easy. It's anything but that. And those visualize and interpret, to be honest, I think can be done the opposite way around. I'm very visual, so for me it's find a way of visualizing it first, and then I'll work out how I'm gonna see that information. That could equally be the other way around. If you're very tables and just looking at numbers driven, then actually it's, what does that say, and then how do you visualize that afterwards? I think that has to be a hand and glove approach to both of those things. And then obviously once that communication piece to whoever that is, if that's your physical performance team, your medics, coaches, players, however that works, there'll always be questions. So actually you then come back to, how can I interpret the information that I currently have, or actually do I need to go and collect more information? And then it's almost a loop. So we've got a real simple flowchart process there, but actually it's anything but, and it's very non-linear most of the time. In terms of automations and systems, I think it's so important to have a system that you use, and that can be as simple as paper and clipboard and pencil. You know, it's that simple, or it can be a lot more complex, but having something really clear with yourself, how are you going to actually action what you do? In my environment, this is obviously there's a saying in computer tech. Obviously, the problem often exists between the computer and the chair. So actually, we're often the issue. And any steps that we have that involve us and us doing actions, then there is the potential for missing stuff. And something I'll come back to later on. But just understanding that we're often the problem, not always the answer. So coming back to that kind of landscape picture again, is what's my current landscape? What different data streams do I currently have? Two very different ones. In the WNTS role, it's me and the rugby coach with a consultant physio, obviously supported by our central programs, but fundamentally day to day, it's just the three of us. And then a women's national side, obviously it's a really, really big team of 20 plus support staff around the playing group. So two very different landscapes and two very different sets of data and how I'd manage those. In terms of the national side and kind of what we're looking at is, we have GPS data through Stat Sports. We have kind of physical profiling data through the VALD suite of performance tools. We use Bridge for all our gym-based monitoring, and then TSO and transitioning over to Kitman around our kind of wellness and that side of stuff. And then Prevent in terms of the new one that came in for the women's side this year, around the kind of gum shield and instrument and mouth guard monitoring and how that's all going. So they're 5 very quick different data streams that we have. at the moment. I'm sure I've missed some, but there's different data all being in different places. That comes into some of the challenges. So some of those data sets are massive. You look at every drill of every training session that we've got a bank of over the last 3, 4, 5 years. It's a very, very large data set. And then you add in all the physical profiling data. So every kind of movement jump, or every single leg kind of movement jump, or drop shot, any of the tests that we do, you have every rep of that recorded. Again, on quite a wide range. So you've got the national players on the women's 15s, 7s, all integrated within one system. So it's all through VALD and through their cloud system. We have that all the way down through the pathways, across the men's and women's side, through the age grades and down into the NTS and WNTS pathways. So there's some really big data sets. We have, again, as I said, different sources of data. So how do we manage those things? And we have different platforms. So how do we manage the data across the different platforms that we have that I've mentioned earlier on? Whenever you have these different softwares, they all have different outputs and different ways of visualizing and presenting their data, which sometimes is great. Sometimes it does exactly what you want it to do. Sometimes it's not quite what you want. And obviously you have those different challenges in communicating information with people in a way that they understand and that makes sense to them. And again, so it's the cleaning, the combining and visualizing of that data. So one of my steps earlier on was cleaning that data. You have a squat jump that isn't a squat jump, or you have somebody drove home with their GPS unit on and they're traveling at way above the speed that they should be. So you have to clean that data and clip out those errors that naturally exist in any way that we present data or anything that we collect. There's always going to be things that we go, oh, that's not quite what I want it to be. So actually, how do we clean that and process it and combine those different data sources to help us paint a bit of a picture? And then how do we show that the way that we want to show it? And that's at time. We're all time poor. It's the most valuable resource we have, and we can never have enough of it. No matter where we are, we're always going to want more time. So in terms of the tools that we use, we're really lucky within the RFU. We have a Tableau system that's run by our incredible data scientist, and everything across the union, across the 4 provinces, through the age grades, all gets housed through Tableau. That's at the moment used for very big, broad picture stuff, which is evolving massively. But again, as I was speaking about time there, our data scientist, Andy Well, is only one of him, and he's got a lot of people asking him a lot of questions. So in terms of how we're evolving our processes, as most people probably do, you start off with Excel. It's a Microsoft program a lot of people have access to, and it does a lot of things that we want it to be able to do. My journey from there kind of took me on to Power BI, and how can I, using a Microsoft platform that I'm very comfortable with and in a very similar way, how can I get that to do some of the things that I was frustrated with Excel? I'm very visual imagery, click based. That's why I became a coach, not a strict data scientist. I'm more click based than I am writing code and writing script. So for me, Power BI was a lot more click based. I know some guys have gone down the R route, and I don't know if that's something I'll ever do in the future. But Power BI definitely solved some of the problems for me around writing long Excel codes, where if I wanted to change things, it was more typing rather than the click-based interface of Power BI. But within that, there's certain things that you just have to find a way around, and learning the kind of DAX part of Power BI I found really, really useful. And actually, it's helped me solve a few problems that I didn't anticipate. And as things evolve, you always have those problems that pop up and go, oh, I wonder about this. And I'm quite inquisitive, and that's kind of how I go about my work is, oh, I wonder about this, and then end up on a path to, can I solve that problem? Or a coach comes to you and goes, oh, I want to be able to see this. Okay, well, actually, can I find that solution, or at least a workaround solution for them in the meantime to help answer their question? So yeah, that's kind of the tools that I'm currently using in terms of how I'm going about our data management processes. In time, I think that'll become more and more Tableau based as the magician that is the whale actually builds on what we're currently doing. But the Power BI for me is working really well so far. So answering those kind of questions that we had earlier on is, what are the demands? So in terms of how we're presenting and managing this information, so excuse me blanking out a lot of the numbers for this. The RFU are quite hot on their data privacy, which, as we should, a lot of this data belongs to the players. So it's their data, and we have to be aware of that when we're sharing it. But this is weekly totals of a player during our recent Women's Six Nations. So it does look quite messy, hence the different colors, just to help break it up a little bit. So we've got our kind of total distances on the left, our zone 4, 5, and 6. We have those individualized based off players, individual max speeds. What was their max speed of that week? So the purple box there. What percentage of that was their individual max was that? Their zone 6, their accelerations, their decelerations, and their HMLD, so high metabolic load distance, which is a really good marker of overall high intensity load. The lower speed loading is actually a really interesting one. It's something that we're starting to look at a bit more, but in terms of this presenting to the coaches, I haven't really gone down that so far. But the top left box there that's blanked out is a kind of drop down selector for players, which helps us really quickly go through and go, actually, what did their campaign look like? So that then helps inform us around what does the next campaign look like if it's a similar schedule, because actually you don't just have to tolerate the game, you have to tolerate the training load that supports that. Obviously we manage players day to day, week to week, that's part of our roles, but ultimately it takes a brave coach to be picking a player who hasn't trained at all. So there's a training and playing load associated with getting through a campaign like that. So what does a week look like? Again, similar kind of format. Just in terms of that consistency, I think it helped the people looking at this report was mainly our physical performance team, but helped them kind of, if you keep the layout broadly similar, they know where the things are, rather than that being a different approach to the more longer term tracking in the previous slide. It's the same kind of thing. So looking at what did their days look like, you get a bit of an idea of what that week looked like. It was a Saturday game week. So you understand what the week looks like, what did that look like? And if we need to manage players, actually, what is it we're looking at managing? Again, lots blanked out here. It's mainly names. But this is a snapshot of a session report. So we'll have all of our players' data in there. Distance per minute, high metabolic load efforts. So our high-speed sprints, accels and decels primarily. How many of them was there? And then what was the max speed that they hit? And then in the big table on the left, there's conditionally formatted with some bars, which has our total distance, HMLD, zone 4, 5, 6, and accel and decel numbers, which just helps provide a little bit more granularity to what we're looking at. And again, we tend to look at this in two ways. So how did the player compare to the rest of the group, but also we block them up into position groups. So actually, how did they compare to the rest of their position group? And it's something we'll come up on later on, is adapting what we do based on that information. So this is a key part of that, and it's something that's evolving. And I know Stat Sports are pushing quite hotly is the MIPs, so max intensity periods. So for us, this was a 90-second max intensity period. So what was the worst case demand 90 seconds of that day look like? And we're presenting this back to the players as a percentage of their positional norm for meters per minute. So that's the metric we're looking at, is distance per minute, and what was their worst case 90 seconds compared to their average position. Again, there's some big variations within those position groups. We've got some girls out at 122% there, and some down at kind of 82, 83. It's always better if you can have those individualized. And speaking to a couple of guys in different provinces, is that they have the outliers, and we definitely have one or two outliers within their position groups, which skews the averages. Obviously, the bigger a data set you collect, and that's kind of where we're looking to take this, is actually it's compared to yourself. And then it'll be, what does your 90-second look like compared to your average 90-second demand look like? So there's obviously a couple of reasons why we're doing that. It's looking at, are we getting the rugby stimulus that is challenging them in that worst case scenario? And are we getting that stimulus from the rugby? So we can do all the conditioning we want. There's a very different level of fitness, if you want to use that term, involved in hard rugby for an extended 90-second period. And again, we're looking at that across positions. And was there So we're looking at the block of 4 green on the left. Is that something we did around that position group, or did that session actually allow that position group to express that max 90-second period? Where the group of purples on the bottom right there, well, actually, that position group were obviously taxed and obviously put them in scenarios that allowed them to work hard. If we use that term, they had the opportunity to express that maximal kind of meters per minute in that 90-second block. So we spent quite a bit of time looking at that, going, actually, that's part of it's on us as a coaching group to put them in scenarios that allow that. Part of it's on the player to take that opportunity. Alongside that, RPEs, we go on a really simple 1 to 10. I know there's loads of different ways of doing that are potentially more valid and reliable. It's something that our players are used to and are comfortable with. And we look at these as a very individual thing. So again, we group them up into positions. But looking at, we always have within any group, you have those high reporters, or you have the people who you could do the worst session in the world and they give you a 6 out of 10. You know, there's never a 10 out of 10 for them. But what is worth reporting is definitely looking at the position groups and going, actually, well, okay, the person second from the bottom there on that left-hand side column obviously found it quite a bit harder than those around her. So what was it that she found difficult? And it starts a conversation. A lot of what we do, and you can collect all the data that you like, but a conversation obviously goes a long way. What our GPS doesn't tell us a lot of the time is the collision. I know there's a couple of people working on collision load, but scrummaging, mauling, those things that are very difficult to quantify. They're not running base metrics. So actually, what was it that made that session hard? And the example I just showed there was actually, there was a lot of scrummaging in that session, and the player found the scrummaging demand very, very difficult. So actually, that was the challenge for her. But opening up that conversation and going, well, actually, we've taken our RPEs. I've looked at your GPS metrics. There's no obvious explainable reason why you would have found that session so much harder than your position group. But actually, the conversation off the back of the RPEs helped us establish that and understand the why, putting the jigsaw pieces together. So the demands, this fella on the right-hand side there is our new head coach of the women's national side, Scott Beamond, and he's pretty good with data. He gets it. He's quite demanding of us around what we're doing, but he also actions that quite quickly, and he's really receptive to feedback and wants to know more about how we can our suggestions as to how we can improve things from a data side whilst keeping rugby at the forefront. And the way that he wants to play the game is going to be hard. Do you know, those demands aren't going down, they're going to increase. But it's also completely up to him. You know, if he wants to change the way that we're playing the game. At the moment, we're playing a really attractive open game of rugby, but if he decides tomorrow that he wants to go more physical and it's going to be a lot tighter and a lot more collision based, then we have to adapt what we do and adapt how we're interpreting the information that comes into us, because the coach's philosophy is always going to impact that. At the moment, we're getting a lot of higher running speeds and higher running loads because that's the way we're playing. But that can obviously change with a different head coach, or if the coach change how he would like to play the game. So the demands of sport generally around the world are increasing. Women's rugby is no different to that. But obviously, just being aware that the technical, tactical part of the game is hugely important and will definitely impact the data that you collect. So that's looking at what the demands of the game are, and are we ready for those demands is the second question I had. So in terms of the data that we're collecting, we collect a lot of stuff. This is a kind of counter movement jump dashboard, if you want to call it that, based off kind of Chris Bishop's work around the output driver strategies and how do we select the metrics that we look at. For me, I think there's one thing that we've spoken about a lot and often gets forgotten is the context, and actually having the body weight in there as well as a jump momentum, which obviously John McMahon's posted quite a lot on and published quite a bit of research on, which anytime you have a sport where momentum is important, like our game, or there might be a significant change in body mass, it's definitely worth reporting because it gives you context to the rest of the metrics. So the outputs in terms of jump height is one that everyone understands, everyone always wants to know about. RSI mod, again, there's a question as to whether it's an output or a strategy, but it's how high and how fast. You know, the players want to know that. what drives that in terms of the eccentric, concentric forces, force at 0, and then looking at the different durations of that and the counter movement depth to really give us a better understanding of the strategy that the athlete used, and if there has been a change in the outputs, what's driving that, or actually has there been a change in the strategy rather than the key underpinning driving metrics. So putting those all on one page, I know it does look quite busy, but I think it helps tell a bit of a story around what's happening when we're measuring counter movement jumps. You'll notice in the top right there, that just says performance. So the counter movement jump performance. We also report a few different things in different contexts. So looking at return to play, obviously you'd look at the performance metrics as well. And I'm aware this is a fairly busy slide. But if you're looking at return to play athletes, then actually there's a few different things that might help us say, well, actually, how is that injury progressing? Or is there anything that we're seeing in those jumps that we might actually want to look into before it becomes an issue? How far away are they from their norms in certain key metrics? So I've kind of broken those down into eccentric braking impulse. Again, this is based off a lot of the stuff from the guys over at Aspetar, and the key metrics they're looking at in their return to play athletes across a few different things. The eccentric braking and what asymmetry does that have in that middle block there, as well as the anytime you report an impulse, understanding that there's force and there's also time component. So actually, is that the force or the time that's changing in that kind of bottom left there? Same on the right hand side, you've got your kind of concentric impulses with the force and the time components. It's obviously worth mentioning there. Again, anytime you have a ratio metric, it's useful to see the component parts of that ratio separately, with the asymmetry in the middle, as well as that force at 0 velocity. Particularly when you have knees in a counter movement jump, you do tend to see differences in that kind of force at 0. For those not familiar with the kind of force plate metrics, that's how much force are you pushing into either of those legs in that split second that you're still at the bottom of a counter movement jump. So you've done your descent, there will be a split second where you're still before you start actually jumping up in the air, as well as the eccentric peak velocity. How fast are you happy to drop down quickly? Nordics, this is a good example of actually how DAX helped me out a little bit here. So with a Nord board with Valve, you don't actually measure weight at any point. So how do you convert that to newtons per kilo, which a lot of the research is telling us is actually more important than the raw numbers? You're heavier people, naturally there'll be more force involved, but potentially relatively less force. So how can you find a way of getting the body weight in there? And for me, that was writing a DAX formula. I found a way of going, well, actually, what was the last recorded body weight they had from a counter movement jump? Okay, well, actually, if there's nothing this week, or take the average of this week. Okay, if there's nothing this week, then can I search TSO or our Kitman Lab systems of their morning monitoring? Do I have anything in there that's going to give me a body weight for this week? Okay, no. Next step, well, actually, do we have any counter movement jumps in the last 14 days? No. Okay, well, actually, do we have any TSO data in the last 14 days? No. Okay, what have we got in the last month? Again, from the force plates or from TSO. So again, it's not a perfect way, and that body mass can change, but it's a way of solving that problem, taking those average body weights when you don't have a system that currently measures it. And then again, we use that 10% threshold all the time, and I know we probably shouldn't, and there'll be people tearing their hair out of the fact that we're looking at that, but can we get above that 5 newtons per kilo within 10%? It's a real rough kind of ballpark of where we are from an asymmetry and a max imbalance perspective with our Nordics. We also do quite a bit of seated calf and generally isometric testing. So how we got the tissue strength in a few different things. That lower speed loading I spoke about earlier on, that we're looking more into. The calf gastroxoleus complex generally around the ankle is challenged a lot with that. So actually, how does that work? And over on the left hand side here, we've got our peak vertical forces, left in the white, gray on the right hand side, and the right side. What does that look like? What's our asymmetry percentage? And then what's that relative to their body mass? Again, obviously it's easier. You test it on a force plate, so you have the body weight from that. But can we get above that two times body weight in a seated isometric? The max force at 100 and 200 milliseconds, a lot of people talk about it, but it's a lot more stable to use force at time points than it is that RFD, which we know is incredibly noisy. But even within this, with the setup that we have, and the guys down at Munster have posted a lot around how that we've developed that using a ratchet strap, and it's a really good, reliable way of getting peak force. But actually, the setup sometimes is showing us that the force at time points is a bit unreliable, and sometimes it'll be very unstable. So we do show it, we do look at it, mainly in our return to play cases where we'll be really strict on, actually, I want you to push really hard and really fast here. That is our cueing. Our language is so important anytime we do isometric testing. But the main thing we're looking at in our isometric testing is the peak forces with a secondary view on those kind of force at time point metrics. So that's kind of how we're looking at some of those data points. With, are we ready for the demands? But actually, how are we responding to the demands that we're putting on players? So it's cliche, but talking to players, you know, like we're quite good, I think, as a staff, is we make a point of chatting to every player every morning, and that's every member of staff will touch base with every player every morning, even if it's just a hey, you know, it's a hey, how you getting on, fist bump here, handshake there, whatever way the girls want to go about it. Asking them how they're doing is so valuable. Sometimes they'll tell you, sometimes they won't. Some players you have a great relationship with, some players actually you're not the best person to have that conversation with them. They might open up to somebody else, and it's being okay with that. And we're quite good as a physical performance team, and actually as a wider staff, of acknowledging that they're very unlikely to open up to a head coach about being tired. You know, that's the reality. He's the one that picks the team most of the time, so they're not going to be, oh yeah, I'm not really feeling great today. Whereas actually they might open up to myself a bit more because they know that I don't have that kind of power over them. Is a horrible term, but you understand what I'm saying, is that they'll open up to different people about different things. We also collect information through TSO, so the sports office, or Kitman Labs as it's about to become. So what we look at there is a general morning monitoring that all the players fill in. That'll be a body weight, groin squeeze, knee to wall, and sit and reach. General physical movement tools, and we add in a few individual pieces. So actually, if we have somebody we know struggles with shoulders, then we'll add in a specific test for them, or we know there's somebody that struggles with certain things, and we'll add in individual pieces. But that's what we collect as a general, which it just helps us open up that conversation. You know, if we spot something on the monitoring that's outside of that player's normal bandwidth, then actually it helps us say, hey, actually, I noticed your knee to wall's down today. What's going on there? Oh, actually, I got rolled on yesterday, and physio, I'm going to see them this morning. Perfect, fine. Oh, well, actually, your sit and reach is down today. What's going on? Not a great night's sleep. Hamstrings are pretty tight from the sprint work we did yesterday. Okay, great. Well, actually, we can then provide the players with some options of actually a bit of extra hamstring mobility, or actually wait and see how you get on later on, or we can give targeted interventions to those players that actually we can then retest and go, actually they're feeling a bit better now. Or it might be something that's just worth flagging with a physio, or actually what can we do to impact. But ultimately it comes back to those inputted data helps us start a conversation, which then helps us action stuff. And then every morning as a staff, we'll kind of have a sit down. So post morning monitoring and kind of touch point with the players, as we'll sit down as a physical performance team and just go through the players and go, hey, what have we noticed this morning? Who was in to see physio? What's their prognosis in terms of training today? Is there anything, targeted interventions, modifications in the gym that we need to make? Do we have any metric targets for people? Actually, we can look through our GPS data and go, actually, they've had a lot of sprint work already this week. Actually, we maybe need to back them off. Or actually, we haven't got any. We need to top them up a little bit. Same with our rehab players, is looking at how do we progressively load them towards where we know we need them to be from a rugby outputs playing side of things. So how we monitor, again, this is off the back end of how do we monitor what we're doing. So we have different session types, as we call them in with the national side. Different, just use the colors as example here is our darker green and then the purple there. Obviously, in terms of a distance per minute, there'd be our higher tempo sessions compared to the other sessions. So actually, what does that spread look like? And actually, are we starting to understand what the demands of those sessions are? Average. Again, the bigger the data set, the more reliable this will become. There is certain things that we can look at in terms of position groups, and that's an evolving process as the deeper we dive into this is, okay, well, what does our purple session actually demand of our back row or our centers, as an example, and actually starting to evolve that process. Same thing with our key drills. So actually, if we, as I said earlier on, Scott wants to play faster at open rugby. So actually, what drills are we doing, and are those drills actually giving us what we think we're doing for the majority of the players the majority of the time? So you're always going to have your tops and your bottoms, and that's why I quite like the box plots, but also having the clusters alongside it helps really bring that to life a bit more. So actually, are the drills getting us the information that we think that we're getting, and are on average we getting this from those key drills? And then just looking at the session types again, so it's pretty clear that our purple and our lighter green color there are our two big sessions of the week. So actually really helping visualize that with the coaching staff and saying, hey, actually, when we say we're looking at an orange session, actually, are we getting that? Yeah, great job, you know? Or actually, what does our purple look like? Okay, there's certain players that are in bits of that, out bits of that. So we obviously need to be aware of that, but just making sure that we're actually analyzing what we do from a more global rugby perspective. And then there's the one that's been quite spoken about a lot across rugby recently, and is the instrumented mouth guards. And obviously that's a monitoring piece by us as support staff during training, but then by the matchday doctor around games, and looking at those thresholds in terms of head accelerations and maximal rotations of making sure we're getting players checked if they have significant head impacts, you know. And there's been a lot of good, bad, indifferent. It's a process we're figuring out. I think World Rugby are figuring it out, as are all the other people around the different nations I've spoken to. But it's there for the right reasons, and actually, it's just one of those things that's helping us inform, making sure that if people get hit hard, that they're getting looked at. It is something that we've had to adapt to, and it does take time. But in terms of things that we're monitoring, that's also something that we're monitoring. That lives in its own independent cloud that World Rugby are looking after, but also we access the data. And if we have any significant head impacts in training or games, then obviously we can look through and go, well, actually, what was that? What was that impact? Where was it caused? We can then speak to our analysts and see if we can get the footage of it. So syncing that up in terms of our timings of having our GPS, the mouth guards, and the analysis all on the same kind of time code has been really useful for us around that. And then in terms of what the future holds, you know, there's so many different ways that things are going to go. I think looking at the internal training load, so particularly heart rate response, is going to become a lot more popular and a lot more accessible to a lot of people. I know some sports use it a lot now. It's probably going to be coming into rugby, I'd say, fairly soon, a lot more. And looking at what are the responses that should give us a bit of a better idea around, well, actually scrummaging and mauling and line outs, even though there's very little mechanical loading from the locomotive distance, there's a lot of load going in there, you know, and actually understanding how the players are responding. Also potentially looking at, well, actually, if our session demand is X and our heart rate response is Y, and then 6 months later our session demand is X and our heart rate is Y minus 10%, well, actually, that's progress. You know, we're getting the same outputs with less physiological cost. So I think that's going to be a part of it. At the moment, myself, I don't use any APIs or anything like that. It's a process of, I do use the folders in Power BI quite a lot, and that's been a massive game changer. And I'm sure it's something the guys at DSS have spoken about as well, is actually, rather than having that manual input where it's copy and paste into one spreadsheet, is using the folders has been a massive game changer in terms of saving me time. So would highly recommend. But then in terms of, obviously, ideally having an API with that information to automatically into your data visualization software is huge. And again, it's something Andy's working on with our Tableau system, of having all that Val data automatically downloaded through the cloud into that system. Again, we'll still need to clean it, but having that data come through automatically, there's no steps involved in it, is really, really useful. And yeah, I think it's just understanding that, as with data, it's going to evolve, and AI and all those kind of things, it's going to evolve, and there's just being okay with the fact that things will change quite quickly, and it's being adaptable enough to acknowledge that. And I think that's the main thing for us as a support staff in any environment, is just being adaptable to what changes within your environment and within your landscape, but also the world outside it and the different tools that we have available to us. I think that's all I've got for you. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to give me a shout.
Thanks, Greg. Really good, really interesting, very up to date, and very progressive. It's fair to say that you're kind of at the cutting edge in terms of your data, and that it's only going to become more important, really. Just if people do have questions, like Greg has asked, please feel free.
Doesn't look like it.
Okay, I just have a couple of questions, the kind of things that maybe some of the members across the board might have. How did you learn the skills, Greg, to become, like, how did you move on from, like most people start using Excel and they tinker around with it. Like, how did you progress along using platforms?
Yeah, like very self-taught, to be honest. I wasn't lucky enough to have the options through DSS. You know, there's a lot of great stuff. People putting out specific courses around using data in sport. You know, it's so valuable. It was mainly just a frustration with anytime I wanted to change anything, I'd have to go into Excel and then rechange a code of something which, as I said, for me just wasn't working for me. So, well, actually, there must be a better way of this. Googling through and going, actually, what do people outside of sport do? How do they better visualize the information, and how do they better create those images for the players and for their staff? And looking at the business world, and how do they visualize that information? And self-taught through Google and YouTube, to be honest. There's a few guys out there doing stuff in sport now, but a lot of them is business, and it's actually figuring it out as you go. And I think half the battle is just committing to trying it. And even if it's a project where you go, actually, I'm going to stick with my Excel for my current day-to-day job, but actually I'm going to try and figure it out. You know, I've spoken to a couple of guys that have done the same with R. They figured it out along the way. And obviously it's great now. There's people that can offer you that kind of fast track on the motorway rather than through the woods. Like, I had to figure it out, but it was mainly a frustration with the fixed outputs that you get from the different stuff, and actually wanting to visualize certain things or having questions. Ultimately, it came back to, I had questions going, oh, I want to be able to look at that. So I had to figure out a way to look at those things, even if they're on different softwares or different systems. So yeah, it was being curious and having the questions of, well, I want to look at that, and finding a way was how I started with it. Really, it was, yeah, just download it and give it a try.
Mm. And just, I noticed that the information that you were displaying based on the players at different camps and also in games, and then there's so much more for the players. How much data are you showing the players? Are you showing their data to themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mark. So the thing we actually went with this most recent campaign is we actually went with less, and actually making that data more impactful. And MIPs was a big part of what we do, that max intensity period. So actually, and we did explain it to the playing group, is this is about us giving you the opportunity, but also your opportunity to really push yourself in 90 seconds of work. Obviously, you don't know when it's going to be. You could look at the practice plan and go, it's probably this drill or this drill, you know, and 99% of the time for a player it would be. And it would be shared as a group. So it would be, everyone can see everyone's data just around that MIP percentage. That was the one thing that we did share across the group, but I took the approach of being very, very open around, this is your data. If you want to see anything, then I will show it to you. It's your data. It's not mine. I don't collect it for me. But the one thing we had noticed is that if you just send out the data all the time, then you have tight head props coming asking you about their max speed for the day. And you go, that's not important for you. Do you know, like, everyone always looks at stuff and goes, is that really moving the needle? So actually they're chasing something that maybe might be in contradiction with them needing to be stronger and be a better scrummager, and actually the stuff that moves the needle and the stuff that actually helps us win games and develop them as rugby players. So actually streamlining how much we send them, but if they come to us asking a particular question, then being very, very open with it, and actually sitting down with the Power BI dashboards with the players and actually them going, hey, can I look at this week? Yeah, sure, no problem. We'll bring up your data. Let's look at this week. Oh, okay, what did that look like compared to last week? Okay, well, actually, that's easy enough to do in Power BI. real click drop down box type stuff, you know. So and them being very, very receptive to that, and there was quite a bit of uptake on that, and so actually I want to look at my GPS data. I want to look at how do my jumps look compared to this time last year, and them developing questions around it rather than just being hit with here's your session report for today, here's your session report for today, and it becomes a bit dulling almost. Whereas actually, if there's specific questions that they have, then they get to be proactive about that. Or there's a couple of times players ask me stuff and I'm like, hey, actually, I don't have a visual for you right now, but leave it with me. I'll get back to you. So yeah, that's kind of the approach that we took, was actually giving them less initially, but with the idea that it then helps foster an interest and an intrigue.
Okay, and just two more. Just in the data that came back from, say, the Zone 5 and Zone 6 running, we'll say, looking across the camps and the games, the amount of Zone 5 and 6 in the French game was significantly higher. And I think that was quite a difficult game, wasn't it? Wasn't
Yeah,
that?
so sorry, just to be clear, that was just one player in that game. It wasn't.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay, yeah.
I was
So,
just an example player.
okay, so the question I have really then is linked to, in a very one-sided game, does that skew the data somewhat in comparison to a very close game?
Yeah, well, it was a tough game for us. I'm not gonna lie. We fired some shots, as Scott likes to say. We threw some
Yeah.
punches as well. So, yeah, you do have those things, and I think it's any time you look at one snippet of information in isolation, as we said earlier on, it can potentially you have an opportunity for a line break on your own 22, and you go for it, and you get 60 meters of real high speed stuff, or actually somebody taps you on the ankle, and it's the difference between 2 centimeters between 70 meters of zone 6 and 0 meters of zone 6. So starting to understand that, and I think as I said, I'm not sure if I did say, actually, is starting to link in more with the analysis guys of actually how does our physical data really link in with the technical tactical model and the analysis and the footage, and actually what was the specific context of our sprints? What happened to cause that? Or our accelerations, well, actually, were those defensive line accelerations, which is something that I know we're looking at, is, well, are those defensively, or actually are those attacking accelerations? And with there being a difference, is there a difference? Where are we getting more of them? Actually, can we start to measure our defensive line and our connectedness and those kind of things, which I don't know the answers now. You know, I think a long way of going around the houses saying, yeah, I think it does depend on the specific context. So looking at another sport, right, like Lionel Messi, I can imagine his GPS stats aren't particularly mind-blowing, you know, but it's the effectiveness of what he does. It's huge. So I think there is always that piece of that data driven versus data informed. You know, it's the part of the picture. But yeah, no, it's a good question, and that player definitely had a fairly high zone 6 load during that French game, and I'd be interested to go back and look at why.
Okay, and finally, you mentioned AI making your job easier to an extent, and it is clearly, it's something obviously that's encroached into all areas of life. It's an opportunity for you.
Yeah, for sure. Like machine learning generally is something that is definitely going to become usable, and actually having these steps and these tools that take us out of the picture to some extent. Do you know, actually, can we automate those tasks that are the ones that are time draining tasks, or there's likelihood that if I'm copying pasting GPS or a jump report, as an example, that has 200 columns in it and 150 rows, well, actually, if I'm copy and pasting that across, there's a potential that I copy and paste that wrong, or I miss a column, or it's out of alignment, or something that can go wrong there where that causes issues. Whereas actually, simple automations or AI in future, and looking at different ways of, can we automate those tasks where there's potential for us to be the problem, or actually that save us time, is going to be hugely important. So finding ways of doing that now, but also looking at how that evolves in the future. And I think there's definitely some incredible stuff being done in the NFL around AI and their kind of reading of coverages, and how they're using that from the technical tactical point of view as well, which is game changing. If anyone's watched that on Amazon, is absolutely wild, and it changes our experience of watching the game. But also, I won't be surprised if coaches are already using that, and that's definitely spread itself into other sports.
Okay. Greg, unless anybody has any question, finally, I'd just like to thank you very much on behalf of DSS and the members across DSS. It's really informative. This recording will be available for all the members, and I'm going to send out a short synopsis of your presentation. And I think you said if anybody is interested in a copy of the presentation, that you might make it available and we can organize that. So again, thank you very much, and thanks for those who turned up, and hope to see you next time. I think it might be 2 weeks' time for number 2 in the summer DSS Webinar Series. So thanks again, Greg, and thanks everybody for turning up.
Nice, thanks, Mark. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out and shoot me a message on Twitter. Is probably where I'm easiest accessible, or LinkedIn, and more than happy to chat to anybody anytime. Thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you.